On Cannabis Helps Dementia podcast, we learn from leading professionals and others on the front lines of senior care.
Dr. Tishler is an instructor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a cannabis therapeutics specialist with over 23 years of experience.
So, one of the things that is commonly said, with which I have some amount of disagreement, is, everyone's different, so you can't predict how people will respond. I think that everyone is different, but we kind of follow a general model. This is, again, true. If there's a theme here, it's that cannabis behaves an awful lot like every other medicine. All of the conventional medications have, a starting dose, and you start with that, or sometimes you even start below that. But there's sort of a general range of you start here and you advance it like this, and then there's a sort of maximal dose at which point you don't expect to get better. It either worked or it didn't work. And I think that the same can be true for cannabis. There are a few, but fairly rare patients for whom the dose needs to be below 5 milligrams. 5 milligrams is a good starting place. And when I say milligrams now, I'm talking about milligrams of the THC component, but I'm also making the assumption that you're getting a whole plant spectrum
not an isolate.
Along with that.
You're
not
getting a full spectrum
right.
of cannabinoids. And do you find a balanced 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 to be more beneficial?
No, and this is one of those things that you Californians are into that we on the East Coast have not latched onto. I'm very, very unconvinced that CBD is a meaningful adjunct to THC in amounts greater than what we find in the sort of type 1 chemovar, the THC dominant chemovar. That being said, so don't get me wrong, I think CBD is wildly important as a trace amount associated with THC and the rest of the cannabinoids. But when you start to look at CBD sort of as its own therapeutic, I think that there are fairly limited number of instances where it's really been shown to be helpful. The kids with the seizure disorder, absolutely, no question, 100%, right? But beyond that, what we've got a good handful of studies in mice looking at things like anxiety and pain. And mice turn out to be a really bad model for human beings. The other thing is, how much is mouse anxiety related to human anxiety, right?
We do tend to be on a wheel chasing cheese, so I don't know. Maybe it's pretty close.
Here's my wheel right there.
Right.
That's a fair point. When it comes to the studies on pain, what do? They took the mouse and they broke its leg with a hammer.
Right.
How does that have any bearing on my 70-year-old with, arthritic back pain? I don't think it does necessarily. These are the right sort of beginnings of the science. But we need to go beyond that to really get into sort of how does it work for human beings. The thing that really impresses me, though, about the CBD literature is whether you're looking at the kids, the mice, or even the very few adult studies, what you find is that the dose needed to achieve the benefit is enormous.
Yeah.
10 to 20 milligrams per kilogram, right? So if you're talking about a mouse or a small person, it's not that hard to get that dose, right? But when you're talking about people our size, where we're looking at sort of 60 to 70 kilos, you're looking at 600, 700 to twice that in CBD. When you go down to the dispensary or the Whole Foods or the corner gas station and you buy yourself, a little bottle and maybe it has 300 milligrams of CBD in it, that's half your dose for the day, and you just spent, $100, $125.
Well, I think I totally agree with you. any of the studies that I've looked at or seen coming through with CBD, like the schizophrenia studies in Israel, the dosages are just way, they're so high. It does seem crazy that you need that much of a molecule to get a result when you can use the fuller spectrum, and each benefits each other, makes the molecules work better. Is that the case with the plant medicine?
The studies that we've looked at mostly are not isolate studies. They're extract studies. So they're getting full spectrum, and you still need those kinds of enormous doses.
Right.
So, when you start to think about sort of the kind of stuff that's available in California, where you're looking at sort of, 1-to-1 or 3-to-1 or something like that, what I think is going on there is the CBD is really not doing very much. It's just a dilution. Right? So you're getting in a 3-to-1, 1/3 less THC than you think, essentially, right? Could you get the same dose of THC using a THC dominant product and simply taking less? Yeah, you could. But I think that what it does when you dilute it is it makes it easier to sort of take more, and people like more. And it also means that if you mess up, suppose your dose is supposed to be 1 dropper full, but you fill the dropper up an extra, say 20% one day, because it's dilute, that extra 20% is only really actually about an extra 6 or 7% of the THC, and the rest of it's CBD, which again isn't really doing very much. So the actual error there is less.
Right.
I'm not convinced that CBD is ready for prime time, and I'm not convinced that the way in which the California market has addressed this is truly making a medical difference. I think it's much more of a dilution/measurement thing. And again, if we had standardization, which has been proposed recently, then we would have, sort of just a better way of knowing how much people were getting, and therefore which components were more active. Back many paragraphs ago, we talked a little bit about why I don't like tinctures super much. One of the other reasons that I forgot to mention is that when you're doing drops of something, it's awfully easy to screw that up.
Yeah.
Right? If you take a gummy, you either took it or you didn't, right? I mean, assuming you don't stick it in your ear. But when you're doing drops, it's like, oh, was that 9 or 10? Oh, I guess it was 10, or I guess it was 9, or whatever.
And you never get a good measurement in those things. You can never get an actual half a milliliter or a liter, it never fills properly. You never get it right.
On top of that, it turns out that the cannabis industry hasn't caught on to the fact that in the science world, there's a standard of 20 drops per ml, right? So patients will call me up and say, Doc, I'm using this tincture, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, well, how much are you taking? And they're like, well, I take 1 ml. I mean, usually they say I take a dropper full, and then I'm like, I have no idea what we're talking about. Right. But even if they say 1 ml, the question is, how many drops are there in that ml, and how much cannabis is there per ml or per drop? Each company does it differently. Right. So you often end up in this situation where I know how much there is per ml, but they're doing it in drops, right? Or the other way around. Yeah. And so if we could get onto that standard, at least there would be more interchangeability and more knowledge of what's actually being taken. I tell my patients, if you're going to use a tincture, don't drop it in your mouth. You can't see what you're doing. Yeah. If you move it, you get a drop down your chin. Right. Maybe you twitch and you squirt a little bit. And now how many drops was that? So what I tell everyone is drop it onto a spoon, right? So you can count it. And if you have a mistake, throw it away and start again. And then when you have the spoon measured out, now you take it like cough syrup, put it in your mouth, swallow it, chase it with something because they all taste nasty, and you're done, right? I mean, that's just, I think, a much better way of doing this that doesn't lead to, how much did I take?
And you don't have to leave it in your mouth for 2 minutes?
Exactly.
How exciting is that?
Very interesting, the difference between East Coast and West Coast.
That's very fascinating. Yes, it is indeed.
Find the full episode on iTunes, Spotify, Anchor FM, or any of your favorite podcast platforms. And look for Cannabis Helps Dementia on YouTube.
Why don't you get wise? Get up and get out.